The nostalgic paradigm, the social dimensions of nostalgia. The disenchantment of the future, nostalgia as an antithesis to the dogma of progress. The temporal dichotomies of classical sociology asserted a strong, if not complete, break between modern and pre-modern societies, and with the rising of a radical historical transition they mostly sided in favor of the present rather than in favor of the past. The term modernization suggests a sort of natural progression, an implicit assumption that modern is preferable to traditional, rational is preferable to religious, and so, following this logic, industrial is preferable to agricultural. Modernization, however, was not always perceived as something liberating and progressive. On too many occasions it had been experienced as an alienating loss of traditional skills and cultural practices of ancient lineage. Some assumptions of the sociology of the classical period, concerning the distance between the pre-modern era and modernity, played an important role in creating a particular type of indisposition towards the possibility of expecting a model of temporal continuity which did not consider change, and the departure from the past a priori as negative. Even if the preferability of the future over the past was expressed in multiple ways through the belief in an inevitable linear progress, the strong belief supported by theories such as evolutionism and historicism, and later by functionalist paradigms and theories of modernity, the constant underlying of the discontinuity between past and present created the basis for a different kind of feeling. And it is in the wake of this discontinuity that the nostalgic feeling, intuitively understandable as the conceptual opposite of progress, takes over. Indeed, the belief in the inevitability of progress, and the attitudes of open support towards the future have gradually generated their antithesis, nostalgia for the past. It is as if nostalgia manifests itself only as compensation for a loss of confidence in progress, and for what has been socially and culturally destroyed in the name of progress. Therefore, if a dogmatic faith in progress entailed an ardent longing for the future, nostalgia, on the contrary, implied a strong yearning for the past. This assertion can even be formulated in the following terms: the sense of nostalgia seems to increase and spread in direct proportion to the loss of credibility towards the future. Since the inception of modernity, the future had been a bright and shining presence. Scientific discoveries, advancement of technology, achievements in controlling nature, faith in social engineering, and a certain general intolerance regarding tradition predicted scientific progress would have ensured control over human destiny. When 18th-century intellectuals began to believe that human history was linear, irreversible, and cumulative, this belief and new confidence in progress, accompanied by a faith in science promising to improve the human condition in an endless crescendo, spread throughout society. The conception of history has positive connotations, largely deduced from the trend of economic production supported by industrial expansion. The advent of the modern creed of progress is accompanied by a detachment of the limits previously imposed on the horizon of expectations, accelerating the loss of a boundary of meaning that once linked together past and future, and ensured the linkage of experience and expectation. And it is at some point in history that many authors identify with the interwar period that worries about what disappeared in the name of progress began to emerge, especially among intellectuals. In the early 1920s, this sense of faith in progress is sustained by the belief that science and technology would ultimately ensure the advancement and well-being of society. But this optimism is not shared by most of the intelligentsia. Scientific development is no longer able on its own to restore credibility to the idea of social progression. In 1931, Karl Jasper writes that people are beginning to believe that everything is collapsing, referring to the fact that the panic caused by the collapse of the financial markets did not stop at the economic question, but represented a real crisis of confidence. The catastrophe of the First World War eroded confidence in the possibility of a positive change, negating the relationship between history and progress. An entire epoch was summarized in the expression, "The wasted years, the barbarities of war shattered the credo of progress," followed by a period of economic depression and class conflicts, after which another even more barbaric war than the previous one occurred. Although it is possible to identify periods of relative optimism after World War I, the idea of progress will no longer be able to seduce the minds of intellectuals. But it is from the 1960s that lack of confidence in progress and fear of the future find a more general expression. Instead of the presumption of progress, a sense of malaise, crisis, and decline took hold not only of social theories, but also of the thoughts of the ordinary man. Nostalgia and the crisis of modernization. Towards the end of the 19th century, the dark side of modernity became more visible. The first signs of this are found in revolutionary romanticism, whose resonance can be found in Hegelian thought. Indeed, in the period following the French Revolution, modern society is often portrayed as alienating and destructive, a vision that can be linked to the failure of the revolutionary dream. Even the Nietzschean idea of an eternal return of the equal can be seen as the rejection of the Enlightenment concept of time as historical and linear in favor of a conception of time as a series of positions. Husserl will later affirm that modernity is based on the effort to recover something that has been lost due to the rise of positivism and naturalism. Before the Enlightenment, Europeans considered the past and future as unchangeable and predictable. The story began with the creation and ended with the apocalypse. The Bible was not only the custodian of the history, but also a model for the future one. The assumption of an idea of eternal sameness made us think of a future cut out from the past, which would follow in its footsteps without going too far. In this regard, we can speak of a traditional future, a sort of future that is comforting and familiar on the one hand, but on the other inevitably precluded from change. The first victims of the surge in the rhythm of history were social stability and intellectual security, where the second had as a direct consequence the loss of confidence in the teachings of history. In this regard, it was about reducing the space of experience and widening the horizon of expectation. The past saw its role diminished due to the acceleration of historical time, and became less and less a guide for the future. If the Industrial Revolution and colonial expansion, on the one hand, confirmed the bright forecasts for a future full of promises, on the other hand, however, people began to glimpse the downside. And it is precisely when the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, such as the breakdown of the continuity of history, began to be perceived as psychologically and socially disastrous that a sense of nostalgia for a now unrecoverable past spread. This also explains why this sense of nostalgia has continued to take root until it becomes a feature of today's common feeling. The more confidence in the technological future recedes, the more nostalgia advances, occupying new territories of cultural life. The fear of total annihilation, first left by Hiroshima, and then by Chernobyl, as well as for any environmental accidents like later on Fukushima, for example, meant that nostalgia embraced the realms of nature and the environment as its elective setting. Starting in 1989, the first conferences on the global situation began to be organized in Paris, London, and Amsterdam, and that this fact is symbolized for some observers the end of capitalism with its boastful hopes of unlimited conquest and total dominion of nature. In his book,
Nous n'avons jamais été modernes. Essai d'anthropologie symétrique.
Latour argues that the symmetrical reactions of those who worry about the destruction of nature by man, and those who never get discouraged from ending the exploitation of man on man, both are reactionary anti-modern expressions. In general, science and technology themselves raise doubts about the future. Still, at least until the first half of the 19th century, the project of the science of redefining the world was considered essential for generating well-being, and faith in progress came to be the foundation, the norm of Western thought. Optimism in the future reigned supreme. Yet, gradually this confidence in the beneficial effects of progress loses its bite, not only because the evil effects seem to become increasingly harmful and insidious, but above all because the long-awaited benefits have become discounted. Durkheim indirectly supports something very similar when in the elementary forms of religious life he writes that the great things of the past that filled our fathers with enthusiasm do not arouse the same ardor in us, because they have become of common use for which we are no longer aware of it, or because they no longer meet our aspirations. Jacques Le Goff explains in General Reflections on the distinction between past and present in historical consciousness that the past is rejected only when an innovation is judged to be both inevitable and socially desirable. Besides, the unplanned and often unexpected technology's side effects generate an upset restlessness caused by the fact that no one does know the extent of those damages and how to remedy them. Just think of the concerns caused by problems such as the risks of nuclear power, the greenhouse effect, the hole in the ozone layer, the decrease in biodiversity, and damage to the ecosystem, but likewise in the realm of biotech, for instance with the vaccines or brand new technologies like CRISPR. The disbelief about the assumptions that technological progress will make people happy has now made its way into the consciences of most people. In response to the growing pessimism towards the collective future, one's future is instead colored with optimism and positivism which, no longer justified on a general level, is being privatized. Individuals are nowadays led to believe that one's salvation lies in the personal life project, as the horizon of expectations no longer extends into the afterlife, intended as the culmination of what lies beyond the space of our worldly experience. But this mentality, characteristic of 19th-century bourgeois thought, increasingly assumes in the middle class of the 21st century meaning of pure survival to the "I hope that I will get on with it." As most individuals, even those citizens of the most developed and democratic Western states, have little, very little power to shape the circumstances that govern their lives, the ability to cultivate global perspectives is increasingly lacking. The future is more frequently short-term, as the long-term future is dimly designed by terms such as decline, disaster, and chaos. The subculture of flower children looked back rather than making plans for the future. The rural hippie communities abhorred technology and money, inspired by a sort of pre-capitalist past. The hippies still believed in a utopia which, rather than being realized in the future, could be lived in the present, and which referred to elements of tradition. On the other hand, postmodern yuppies have lost all reference to the past and lack any vision regarding the future. Life is now. Living for the present is the dominant obsession, living for yourself, not for predecessors or posterity. We are rapidly losing the sense of historical continuity, the sense of belonging to a succession of generations that has its roots in the past and projects itself into the future. Closing the time horizon and retroversion of modernity, the closed future, or when memories prevail over expectations. Starting from the second post-war period, and with progressive acceleration, the experimental uncertainty turns into a real defensive attitude. The future is now openly feared. As far as possible, thinking of the future is exorcised. The expression "a crisis of the future" sums up well this widespread social malaise. In late modernity we assist to a change in the representation of the future typical of the modern age towards an antithetical vision of the future, paradoxically more similar to a traditional concept. In the pre-modern vision, the future was conceived as determined by extra-historical and non-historical instances, whereas in the modern representation it was considered to be designed and created by the actions of the subjects. It is like to affirm that the complexity of the world of late modernity seems to erode individuals' confidence in their ability to guide action, and, consequently, in history. This appears to be attributable to the intricacy of the interdependence chains that characterize the action at the various levels of the systems generated by social differentiation. The closing of the future on itself, therefore, seems to be a generating factor of that nostalgia for the lesser entanglement and interdependence attributed to the social reality of the past. If the period between the Great War and the Second World War represented a crisis of modernity, the current historical epoch can effectively express a second one. The prevailing sense of crisis would have worsened since the collapse of the Soviet bloc. The collapse of the Soviet Union helped to increase the sense of unease and malaise felt in Western culture. As a consequence of this, precisely in response to the sense of anxiety towards the future, a sense of nostalgia of the Cold War would be spreading. Seen from today, that historical period, characterized by the division of the world into two opposing blocs, is remembered as a phase of modernity, at least, stable and predictable. A historical era which, due to the characteristics attributed to it, is capable of arousing a sense of nostalgia. While Western industrialized societies appearing to be more developed and open, they do not even know if they are heading towards the future. In this uncertainty, they keep an eye on the past as if the void behind them had swallowed up the future. Under their apparent mobility and acceleration, they have come to a halt in their hearts and goals. That is to say, they are accelerating, but they are doing it by inertia. In the chapter The Reversal of History of the Illusion of the End, Baudrillard points out that there is an analogy between the sphericity of the globe and the sphericity of time, visible on the horizon of the turn of the century, just as the sphericity of the Earth is visible on the horizon at the end of the day. If in the Euclidean space of history, the linear one of the Enlightenment, the shortest line between 2 points is straight alike that between progress and democracy, in the non-Euclidean space of the fin de siècle this is no longer true due to a curvature that deflects all trajectories. This implies the end of the linearity of history, and the end of the future, which is quite different from the end of history. We are faced with a paradoxical reversal process, a retroversion effect of modernity, which has reached its speculative limit and extrapolated all its potential developments, is disintegrating into its simple elements in a catastrophic process of recurrence and turbulence. The French sociologist and philosopher attribute the cause of this phenomenon to the contamination of the world of life by technology, a technology of retrospectivity, capable of ascending back to the now usual rewind function, not only tapes and films, but also the films of our lives and finally history. Numerous authors have argued that, unlike mercantile and agrarian societies, industrial societies could have done without the past. Moreover, with the disappearance of the past, the determination of personal roots would have also lost importance. This prognosis turned out to be wrong, as its opposite is almost observable. Popular culture is pervaded by nostalgia. Traditions are constantly being invented or recycled. Museums and houses that gave birth to illustrious historical figures become tourist mecca. The lust for antiquity seems to be unlimited. Historical heritage is the subject of popular crusades for those who feel arbitrarily expropriated, as well as a thriving industry for the privileged. Icons and images of past times seem to have the function of consoling the millions of people who feel uprooted. For different reasons, the past offers comfort against present failures, but at the same time foreshadows a sense of danger that prevents us from continuing to have hope in the future. Faith in technological paradises died with Hiroshima, and there are only nostalgic memories of the modernist future. For those who feel more and more attracted to images of past times, the future compared to the past does not have the same charm. Science fiction and other future scenarios pale in front of the rich details about the past provided by history and memories. The future, on the other hand, lacks evidence. What we can be sure of is that it will disobey our predictions. The future remains unpredictable. To give a sense of what has just been said, a metaphor will help. If the past is a foreign country, the future is a chimera. Our collective representations of the past and the future also spring from our hopes, fears, present mental attitudes. What differs is that the past contains a nucleus of integrity, absent from images concerning the future. According to the English writer, historian and sociologist H.G. Wells, the future is affected by an incurable unreality. Every institution of the past, even if irrational or absurd, manages, instead, to radiate an effect of reality and justice, not subjected to an examination of how things should be. Everything about the past has already matured, has been baptized, stained with blood and softened by discussion, has been turned and dented to assume those softened contours that we associate with life. The processes of social and geographic mobility, which often lead to family disruptions, or in any case to the loss of the original social environment, the consequences of wars such as forced migration and genocides, the growing anxiety produced by technology, and the idea of rapid obsolescence, erode the expectations about the future and increase awareness of the past, instilling the idea of needing and deserving the past into millions of individuals. Social change, discontinuity, and experience of loss. However, experiencing the loss is a distinctive feature of modernity, no matter whether, because of war, revolution, or regime change, involuntary mass immigration, or less dramatically due to social mobility or social change or the dispersion of communities stratified in a place over time. The mere progression in the acceleration of change and the concomitant feelings have transformed how the past is considered. Modernity marginalized the understanding of loss to the point of making it taboo, as the feelings connected to it were mixed with others more directly associated with a sense of social liberation, or with those associated to the attempt to regain in another way what had been lost, through cultural practices such as the invention of traditions or nationalism. All this is very different from nostalgia, in that it presupposes an active commitment to overcome the consequences of change. It can be said that many of the studies on the nostalgic phenomenon correlate nostalgia to what is considered to be a characteristic feature of modernity, the relentless social eradication following social and geographical mobility, and, consequently, the erosion of traditional stability. The discourse of loss began with the decline of the institutions in the Middle Ages. Rousseau, Hegel, Marx and Arendt referred in their criticism towards modernity to the Greek polis, where politics was not the exclusive domain of the state, but it expressed itself in the daily life of self-regulating citizens. In these criticisms there is the modern version of social thinking centered on the concept of loss. Both the profane standpoint and scientific assumptions tend to argue that sociocultural change has reached, during modernity and late modernity, a rhythm never previously experienced. There is an image in Marx, that of the aura, a halo. It is the symbol of religious experience, the experience of the holy. In the chapter All That Is Solid Melts into Air, Marx, Modernism and Modernization, in the paragraph The Loss of Halo, Berman clarifies how for Marx the possession of the aura can distinguish between sacred and profane, and how capitalism tends to destroy the possibility of experiencing the holy. As a result, everything that was consecrated in the past becomes mundane. If this fact itself is not completely negative connotated, since life without the halo involves a condition of spiritual equality, it is, however, frightening for someone's. This means that if the modern bourgeois can continue to hold wide social power, it no longer has the spiritual ascendancy enjoyed by the ruling classes of the past. Marx was referring to the French and English and not so much German, the situation in which the pervasive and intense critique of capitalism was about to explode in revolutionary expressions. In the 20 years following Marx's writings, the bourgeoisie will become capable of conquering the aura again within a specifically bourgeois pseudo-religiosity. Marx uncovers the nostalgia of the bourgeoisie for its loss of the aura, for a sacred dimension. Such a nostalgia would have a paradoxical character for being experienced by a class that claims to fulfill its historical role precisely in being secular and emancipated. Nostalgia has often the function of covering up the pain of loss, as it allows for an easy return home, available on request. To this interpretation, it can be replied that nostalgia can instead be considered, on the contrary, as a sounding board that amplifies the sobs of those who have experienced the loss. The nostalgic tale, for example, prefers extrapolation from a context far more complex than the one where only positive facts of the past exist, preferring to leave the aspects that have to do with discomfort and loss. Nostalgia has essentially and intimately to do with the loss. The latter assumes different meanings according to the referent, if so far it has been understood in the sense of loss of familiarity with one's world of life. We can also refer to the alleged loss of memory or historicity, which many authors, including Jean Baudrillard, have associated to the nostalgic phenomenon. Dimensions of the nostalgic paradigm. There have been identified 3 conditions for the emergence of nostalgia. 1. The presence of a secular and linear conception of time, and the concept of progress. 2. The perception of the imperfections of the present, accompanied by the awareness of the absence of a history of redemption, and the impossibility of any salvation. 3. The comparison with testimonies of the past. Also, the feeling of historical decline is among the major aspects of the nostalgic feeling, almost a nostalgia features. However, unlike Chase and Shaw, some authors give more emphasis to the normative side of the phenomenon, insisting on the sense of anomia and lack of moral certainty. The nostalgic paradigm has 4 main dimensions. 1. Sense of historical decline, history as fall. The idea that history began with a golden era, from a condition in which feeling at home or homefulness predominates. Progressive departure from the situation of original perfection, contemporary social systems, taken as a reference against this condition of plenitude, are therefore considered deficient. In a large part of literature and autobiographical narratives around the theme of nostalgia, the feelings associated with looking back towards places or periods of the past reflect a bittersweet relationship, but affectionately and positively sentimental, with what has been lost. A contrast is expressed between there and here, between then and now, in which what is absent is evaluated in some way better, simpler, less fragmented, and more understandable than the extant alternatives in the present. Nostalgia starts to influence the current notion of the historical past when the contrast between city and countryside has been historicized. Before then, historiography was dominated by conceptual schemes of classical or Christian derivation which tended to let coincide historical evolution and decay, but it would be a mistake to call them nostalgic. The change in historiographical knowledge, which occurred in the 17th and 18th centuries, seemed to define 2 consecutive stages of the historical process. What unifies the pastoral tradition with the nostalgia of the 19th century countryside is the belief that the forces of transformation under the sign of industrialization and urbanization are uncontrollable. The nostalgic structure of feeling relates to how nostalgia works as a periodizing emotion. There are 3 key ideas: a world before the fall, the kind of golden age, the fall, and the world after the fall. The world before the fall and the world after the fall may be temporarily not very far, almost contiguous, but this does not mean that they cannot be perceived as sidereally remote. What is fundamental for the nostalgic sentimental structure is that there is a perception of discontinuity. Nostalgia approaches the past by assuming it as a stable source of value and meaning. Nostalgia invokes a past positively valued in response to a present deemed inadequate. A characteristic sign of the tendency towards nostalgia is, therefore, a sentiment of mismatching in the present. By comparing the present with the past, the former becomes the sign of a decline, as in the case of fallen empires, eclipses of nations, or loss of power and position for a particular social group. Those who try to deny the existence of nostalgia for the era of imperialism do so by looking for evidence on which basis the past would be always considered worse than the present. For example, Marshall Berman, in an attempt to immunize his readers from nostalgia, reminds them of what he calls the barbaric character of some life forms that modernization would later succeed in wiping out. In turn, the desire to fight the romantic belief in allegedly harmonic societies just because they are a past has meant that many authors have reproduced an ideology of progress that celebrates modernity at the expense of other life forms, but then yearn for a more stable world, desperately seeking it no matter if in the past of Western industrialized societies, in other cultures, or the combination of the two worlds. And it is precisely this sense of permanence outside history that is decisive in feeling nostalgic. In nostalgia, the past is erected against the present that is accused of having transgressed. The narration of what has passed becomes history of decay, of ruin, in which the future is inevitably worse than the past. Nostalgia involves the feeling that the past offers joys that are no longer reachable in the present. The nostalgic representation of the past evokes a time hopelessly disappeared, and therefore immobile, unchangeable. A counterpoint to this interpretation can be formulated starting from the consideration of the terrible facts that have stained the history of the 20th century, the Holocaust, the two world wars, the arms race, and authoritarian and dictatorial regimes. Despite these dramatic events in recent history, a strong presence of nostalgia can still be observed in social reality and culture. Almost everything that comes from our past can emerge as an object of nostalgia, considering that somehow this can be seen in a positive light. People can experience nostalgia for difficult, hard periods and heavy situations, the Great Depression of 1930, or for moments of the Second World War, even for battles and clashes. Today's experience in Eastern Europe shows how numerous individuals and groups can begin to feel nostalgia for the communist past, remembered, compared to current difficulties, as a period of security, solidarity, and survival despite adversity. the nostalgic attitude towards the past is highly selective, generally idealized, and permeated with symbolism. Nostalgia creates a sort of retrospective mythology, resistant to historical investigation. In this sense, the nostalgic feeling can deeply involve the social construction and interpretation of current phenomena and shape their emotional reaction. For instance, some industrial workers with political conservative tendencies can, just like tycoons and captains of industry, contribute to constructing the myth of a golden industrial past, simply good also for, in the reality, exploited workers. This view is equally contradictory and complex. This trend, by explaining how a masters a current exists, the patrician one, centered on the idea of manufacturing characterized by a stable and orderly hierarchy where the workers had at the same time deference to the employer, yet they were more independent, and where factory pride was the primary motivation. Such a golden past is juxtaposed to current mass production, and in a similar comparison, those aspects that represent a degradation are underlined, as well as the exhaustion of pride, the possibility of identification and vocation. There are at least two ways of reading the alleged decline in these social reflections. On the one hand, the neoliberal reading, which affirms that decadence can and must be hindered, and that believes in a possible restoration of a greatness along with historical guidelines. The restoration of the greatness of the past is feasible, according to this view, through reforms that tend to minimize the taxes imposed by the state and that prioritize the market. The neoliberal reformist vision is accompanied by the romantic tragic one, according to which there is no possibility of a return to the stability of the past. The idea of a golden age is also present in the tradition of left thinking. In The Country and the City, Raymond Williams is reflecting on the idea of a golden age that is supposed to have just disappeared without a trace, says that much depends on the point of view from which you look at the past. It is important to recognize that the nostalgic structure of feeling is not so much a material suitable for a historical explanation, but rather a way of reacting to social facts that imply changes, and as such has real social causes. 2. Sensing the absence and loss of personal integrity and moral certainty. In this dimension, human history is perceived in terms of a collapse of traditional values, which previously brought together and harmonized the levels of human relationships, knowledge, and personal experience. As is known, an unprecedented type of society has formed in Europe since the end of the 18th century, that has unconditionally ceased to enhance the tradition and the past, which has eradicated the golden age to install it in the future, that has devalued memory in favor of other faculties. Thus, the transition from heteronomy to autonomy in the conception of public life took place, from a society in which legitimacy comes from tradition to a society governed by a model of the social contract as a regulatory of institutions. Modern nostalgia coincides with a feeling of mourning for the impossibility of a mythical return, for the loss of an enchanted world with clear limits and values. This dimension of nostalgia is linked to the sociological theory of secularization. This theory, fundamentally associated with the names of Max Weber and Ernst Troeltsch, defines secularization as the process that leads to a loss of temporal power and spiritual authority of religion considered as a universal institutions that profoundly influences the structure of social action, especially in the sphere of economy and politics. More generally, secularization is deemed to pervasively influence the structure of human conduct in the sexual, family, aesthetic sphere. Religion, according to the theory of secularization, would gradually lose its ability to structure and deconstruct institutional behavior, proportionally to the gradual process of the temporal sphere getting autonomous from the spiritual one. The process leading to the disenchantment of the world in the Weberian sense is capable of generating a sense of nostalgia for a society in which a conception of the sacred predominates, and where a secular orientation has not yet taken over, where, therefore, social processes which lead to the emergence of the market, of capitalist relations and urban cultures as a negation of rural naiveties, are not yet underway. Turner provides a nostalgic reading also of the ethics of responsibility, which Weber identifies as an antidote to the polytheism of secular values. Weber presents disenchantment as a process of liberation from the faith, and as a progressive distinction between magic and religion. Its counterpart is the increasing pervasiveness of rationality and computability of the world. In this process, the need for an individual endowment of meaning arises. This means that in the disenchanted world, moral action, no longer being determined by religious rules or by conventions legitimated by tradition, consists in the mere attribution of meaning as a purely individual act. However, this possibility of self-determination produces a sense of disorientation. In Science as a Vocation, Weber states that the modern world has not only lost the certainty of religion, but could lose the security of modern science. Scientific discussion, according to Weber, loses its meaning in principle precisely because of the process of social differentiation in which the various spheres of value are in irreconcilable conflict with each other. The absence of any postulate of unity in modern society, whose condition is, therefore, that of pluralism of values, can lead some individuals to feel a regulatory vacuum, and therefore to get dispensed of nostalgic meanings dispersed in culture, society at large, and politics. The dissolution of the religious and traditional ethos, explains, produces what Habermas will call a differentiation of the worlds of life, a process that makes the possibility of a common, universal morality disappearing. Differentiation becomes here, therefore, an indication of the loss of the totality which marks humanity as such, of its alleged unity, and the disenchantment implies the impossibility of an objective and rational foundation of moral norms. Undecidability is one of the unsurpassed limits of ethics in the world in which polytheism of values exists. Three, sense of loss for individual freedom and autonomy, accompanied by the disappearance of genuine social relationships. In conjunction with this, the strengthening of the bureaucratic state is complained up to a level deemed dehumanizing. This theme refers to the Webian metaphor of the steel cage, linked to the analysis that the German sociologist makes of bureaucracy. It can be said that bureaucracy is a social structure in which rationality has itself become a value or a norm. In economics and society, Weber identifies a series of distinctive defining characteristics of bureaucracy, understood as a rational form of legal domain, in the specific form of public administration, but also applicable to industrial organizations and businesses. Only the more general aspects are summarized here: formal lines of authority, limitation of authority, advanced functional specialization of tasks, constant use of formal procedures for the conduct of the office, free selection of personnel based on competence and technical qualification, qualifications evaluated by organizational rules, not individuals, systematic nature of disciplinary rules. Furthermore, the form of behavior itself so often implemented by bureaucrats, called ritualistic by Merton, that is a way of adaptation to the society which leads to considering the institutional means untouchable, but within the framework of an imperfect adhesion to the institutionalized aims of that society. It is itself a primary character highly problematic to approach, bearing a plethora of paradoxical situations, which in the end hinder the efficiency of the functions they supposedly cover. Another aspect of the nostalgic attitude related to the loss of personal autonomy is the so-called death of the subject. Modernism firmly believed in the distinctiveness of the self, in a unique personality, and in individuality, which was thought to generate a particular and unrepeatable vision of the world, capable of forging an inimitable personal style. According to Jameson's post-structuralist theory, today this view of individualism has entered into crisis. If in the era of competitive capitalism, marked by the nuclear family, and the emergence of the bourgeoisie as a hegemonic social class, it was useful to speak of individualism, today, at the time of corporate capitalism, of bureaucracy both in business and in the state, the old bourgeois individual subject loses consistency. Following the Jamesonian reflections, this way of thinking would be able to generate a sense of nostalgically individual of this kind never existed. It is a cultural and philosophical mystification. But the post-structuralist position regarding identity is now outdated, given the overbearing return of identity as a guide for reflections on the society of contemporary modernity. Today, contrary to what Jameson said, individualism is firmly at the center of the analytical and social scene. Sense of loss of authenticity of the person, of simplicity and emotional spontaneity. Urbanization, the development of trade and ever more efficient systems of production and distribution, as well as the increase in living standards and the rapid increase in the diffusion of knowledge, ultimately progress, was accompanied by the perception of the disappearance of the ancient simplicity. By attracting an ever-increasing number of individuals to cities, progress also created the middle-class metropolitan public capable of reflecting on the possible destruction of nature by uncontrollable forces of transformation. For this 18th century public, the charm of the old agricultural world, raised by pastoral literature, consisted precisely in the impossibility that it could survive the impact with the industrial system. Five, perception of the lack of a clear value position, based on which to exercise criticism of mass culture. The predominant metaphor or way of thinking in contemporary critical theory is necessarily nostalgic, as the critical judgment must inevitably look back. Critical theory would, therefore, entail implicitly a nostalgic appeal to the past, that is, to a situation in which communities and values were integrated, to develop an anti-modern critique of mass culture, of the cultural industry, and modern forms of consumption. A negative and critical assessment of the concept of mass can be traced throughout the conservative tradition, especially in certain academic German rejection of purported leveling dynamics at play within a general apathy of the masses. The criticism of mass society, although not an exclusive peculiarity of the German tradition, the two authors continue, has played a leading role in the development of cultural pessimism. While from the right, aristocratic critics see in mass culture almost exclusively the degradation and caricature of the forms of high culture, requested and inflicted by the masses, radical leftists believe on the contrary, that it is not wished by, but imposed on the masses. The expression a nostalgic paradigm may be eligible as an applicable analytical approach to examine the assumptions underlying the critique of mass culture. In this way, the nostalgic paradigm can become a theoretical perspective suitable for the understanding and interpretation of those critical reflections on society, surviving in the social sciences and sociology, and also existing in more generic considerations originating from the social drive to build one's intellectual position towards social reality. Nostalgia has characterized elitist criticism both explicitly and implicitly, sharpened on the concept of community, of organic social relations, of more natural forms of production. the turn of the 90s, the allure of nostalgia became a transversal emotional outlet at odds to traditional political demarcations. This was the result of the emergence of new trends in a postmodern culture, through rejecting the meanings and identities inscribed within traditional systems of knowledge, reconstructing artistic work in the era of digital reproduction, and overturn the essential distinction between depth and surface, high and popular culture, authenticity and artifice. By putting pressure on certainties regarding taste, values, and cultural identities, such a process would have been able to subvert the usual policy of cultural distinctions. There is a further and different feature of the nostalgic mindset, centered on the memories of childhood or youth. Many interpreters of the human spirit, writers, poets, intellectuals, they, like all ordinary mortals, love to tell about their childhood and youthful memories, depicted as periods in which purity, fantasy, cheerfulness, and light-heartedness reigned supreme. Whilst positive characteristics of this type are attributed to an irrecoverable past, to the present, to more mature age, and to the newer times, negative properties are correlated, for instance, unjustness, brutality, and frustration. This attitude follows the Rousseauian vision, and its yearning for the deviation of instincts represented by the socialization process. Therefore, another feature of the nostalgic feeling is outlined. Six, the melancholic desire to return to a state when individuals were not yet socialized. According to the Freudian vision, nostalgia would be an expression of regression towards a stage of life during which everything was simpler and easier. But while Freud identifies the roots of a possible adult neurosis in childhood, French sociologist and philosopher Maurice Halbwachs is far from considering nostalgia as pathological. In the conception of a normality, the Durkheimian functionalist mold of the Halbwachian analysis emerges, the thesis of the normality of the crime according to which a high degree of anomia is the pathological state of society with organic solidarity, predominantly in advanced societies, where consequently deviance is conceived as an outcome of incompleteness or moral deficiency. The cause of the crime can be found in a conflict between individual interest and collective consciousness. At this point, the question arises whether a strong increase in the sense of nostalgia can still be considered normal. This formulation of the question presupposes a functionalist vision of nostalgia, which, like crime, is up to a certain extent normal and aproblematic. Moreover, like deviance, nostalgia too would perform the social function of making moral boundaries explicit, and is capable of initiating processes of social change. Furthermore, putting deviance and nostalgia on the same level would also coincide with identifying the means to oppose it, strengthening the collective consciousness through socialization and homogenization of cultural ends, as well as through social control, the punishment, for the nostalgic, of being considered a geek or a reactionary. Howbeit Durkheim makes it clear that crime has nothing sicker in and of itself, and therefore punishment cannot aim for healing. If this consideration applied to the nostalgic phenomenon, being nostalgia considered normal, and not representing this a disturbance for the collective conscience, the attempt to eradicate it should not lead to significant results. Analyzing nostalgia regarding the relationship between past and memory also means to pinpoint which traits of the past are generally considered advantages, which aspects of a past time enable us to enhance identity, to take and nurture roots, to accept or flee from the present. For traits distinguish more than others the past from the future, and the present, and constitute its appeal: antiquity, continuity, interruption, sequentiality. About antiquity, four qualities can be distinguished: precedence, distance, and subsequently remoteness, the primordial, the primitive. The precedence gives status thanks to its antecedents. The distance purifies the past for the mere fact of being remote. Pushing the past ever further back depersonalizes it, making its collective and community dimension emerge. The primordial, focusing on the origins, reflects the search for roots, while the primitive promises the virtues of innocence and purity. The search for real or imaginary communities, for roots, together with the yearning for a supposed primitive innocence, represent, as has been said, are the keys to understanding the meaning horizons of the preferences of value contained in the nostalgic feeling. The characteristic of interruption means that the past is appreciated for being completed. This dimension is expressed by a sense of completeness, stability, permanence, all characteristics which, as has been said, are felt as missing by the nostalgic stance. Continuity is perhaps the quality that nostalgic attitude perceives more than others as absent. It is considered capable of making sense of the social knowledge acquired and passed on. Nostalgia often expresses precisely the fear that the inherited knowledge is no longer an important element in daily life, a situation experienced as threatening for personal integrity. Sequentiality is the prerequisite for continuity, implicating a sequential order capable of giving meaning to existences in the sense of attributing a historical context to them. As far as our discourse is concerned, sequentiality recalls the dimension of social reproduction, therefore the structure and rhythms of daily life, and the constructs of common sense, the disappearance or transformation of which are, as has been said, the origin of nostalgic criticism. The nostalgic feeling is in fact related to a past-oriented and fearful conception of social reproduction of the processes of social change. Nostalgia for tradition or modernity. Nostalgia may be described as a relativizing a structure of feeling. The object of nostalgic stance depends as a matter of fact from the point of view from which you look at the past. Given this hypothesis, it becomes interesting to investigate what the socio-cultural forms yearned for by nostalgics are. If it seems intuitive that part of the nostalgic desire is directed towards a type of pre-industrial society, changing the point of observation, it may be that the object of desire also switches. Contemporary nostalgia is often oriented towards proto-modernity, or rather towards a type of modernity, without an adjective or a construct that people would name just modernity. To evaluate this statement thoroughly, let's have here a brief introduction to the postmodern culture, in which the nostalgic observatory can be located. Postmodernism is a notion that appears in literary criticism as early as in the 1950s. It is from the 70s onward, however, that the term comes to indicate all the new developments in the fine arts, as in dance, theatre, architecture, cinematography, and music. Several American critics establish a connection between the idea of postmodernism and the theory of French post-structuralists, considering the postmodern theoretical position in the field of social sciences homologous to the avant-garde perspective in the literary and artistic fields. Thus scholars began to speak of modernism postmodernism referring to the field of art or modernity postmodernity within social theory. A nostalgic yearning for life forms and expressive forms of the past seems to constitute an underground current of the culture of postmodernity. Often such nostalgia more and more includes also a poignant recollection of the times when modernity was still truly modernity, not yet integrated into the treasure chest of traditions. The culture of modernity has long been viewed as a critical counterculture. This happened at least until the 1970s, when its resistance potential has been put under scrutiny, and thus its ability to be counterculture. In this regard, revisionist criticisms highlighted a certain affinity of numerous forms of artistic modernity with the ideology of modernization and progress. It does not matter whether in a capitalist such as, for example, in the case of futurism, or communist such as Russian realism fashion. The change in the understanding of modernist art that is given today, the plurality of analyses and interpretations around the phenomenon which hold it up as a herald of the ideologies of the modernization of the 20th century, or on the contrary expressions of the counterculture, makes the sign of how the evaluation on an era, a style or a historical moment can change. Similarly, revisionist and fickle is the direction of the nostalgic gaze, in the sense that depending on where it rests, the judgment on a historical era and its characteristic features can be paradoxical, quite the opposite. Therefore, if modernity considered from the point of view of postmodernity is often the object of nostalgia, from the point of view of modernity, the nostalgic object par excellence can become a tradition. Without excluding the possibility of the existence of hybrids, such as a postmodern nostalgia for the pre-modern. This in theory, because it is certainly easier to come across a postmodern nostalgia for modernity instead, at least in discourses which have not or enough radical attributes and tones, or on the contrary are not enough rooted in a concrete vision of what the future should or might be, and so to say are quite critical or positive to the social reality, but at the same time not enough constructive, lacking a more deep-founded awareness of the complexity of social life inclusively of solutions. Different from dropping out from society at large or from contemplative gaze leading to escapism, or also sensationalistic pourparlers. Because to really want to return to a state of pre-modern society is something truly radical, but in a way which commences to appeal widely different groups because of its corrosivity and indeed subversive potential, mostly in these last stages of a late capitalistic modernity. Bruno Latour claims that the vague or postmodern wording summarizes the unenthusiastic skepticism of those who neither want to believe in the promises of communism nor are convinced ecologists, therefore anti-capitalists, or positivists are in the sense of faith in principles of scientific naturalism. Postmodernists awaited the end of the century suspended between doubt and hope. Then there are those who reject antisocialist or ecological obscurantism. Being neither anti-communist such as dissidents inside the ex-regimes of real socialism, or convinced neoliberals and capitalist liberals, but not even postmodern. In this sense, deciding to go on as if nothing had happened, believing in the promises of science or emancipation appear the least nostalgic of all. They would, therefore, decide to remain simply modern. But their attitude is disheartened, wanting to remain modern, sometimes appears inconsistent, even out of fashion. To remain faithful in faith in the promises of progress and science, the French sociologist and philosopher seem to be saying, is for a few brave individuals. This last reflection leads us to consider what seems to be describable as the prevalence of the nostalgic attitude nowadays, in time of a late postmodernity. Both souls of modernism, either the one euphoric towards the modernist project, and the one that rejects social and technical modernization, possess the awareness of being at the threshold of the future, on the front of a new life, where it is possible to glimpse the possibility of a new society. Here, this belief in an alternative future seems to have been lost with the advent of postmodernity. Indeed, even, it appears as a false belief, a superstition of the ideology of progress and the Enlightenment. Hugo von Hofmannsthal, a Viennese novelist on the turn of the 19th century, observed that being modern can mean mirroring the times or fleeing them to take refuge in a fantasy world. Von Hofmannsthal writes, "Two things seem modern today: the analysis of life and the escape from life." The desire to escape from modernity can signal at the same time an anti-modern soul that would reveal itself in desiring an object lost in a melancholic and nostalgic tone, or it may take the form of the search for alternative modernity, as in the case of the enchantment for the Orient, Edward Said's Orientalism, or for any other form of exotic primitivism, or even for imagining America. This is precisely the spirit with which Alexis de Tocqueville's work, Democracy in America, should be read. According to Tocqueville, America was the country where democracy would flourish, not Europe, destined for decline. Only the American Revolution represented a success, while the European revolutions 1789, 1848, 1917, 1968 were failures that generated terror, restoration, and respectively, despotism or condescension to power. Based on the so-called nostalgic paradigm, we can insert the vision that Tocqueville draws from the comparison between Europe and America in a strain of a certain nostalgia in sociology. This interpretation enriches the list of sociological reflections that have been identified here as mixed with nostalgia, but in an unprecedented way. If Tocqueville considers Europe in decline and America the prototype of a winning idea, today the nostalgic theories, according to the hypothesis of the nostalgic paradigm, go in the opposite direction. The theory of McDonaldization or Americanization of society, for example, which in fact consider America as a source of a cultural decline. The philosophy of post-histoire and nostalgia. The perspective of post-histoire states that modern society has emerged from history. Moreover, history would be nothing more than an interlude between the static condition of prehistory and the no less static situation of a post-history. As soon as the society of modernity technically equipped itself, made use of scientific interpretation, organized itself socially and politically, routinizing its practices and institutions, its vitality stiffened. The post-histoire theory provides a temporal diagnosis of the situation, Zeitdiagnostische Situationsdeutung, which does not give an interpretation starting from the real and historical stage of progress and of human history, but is only based on a certain idea of history and progress. The concept of post-histoire for some implies the exhaustion of modernity, while for others it means the fulfillment and realization of modernity. The current revival of post-histoire, which had among its supporters the German philosopher and sociologist Arnold Gehlen in 1904 to 1976, was more recently adopted by postmodern theorists, yet the theory itself remains highly controversial. In his reflections on social philosophy, Gehlen expounded his theory of the cultural crystallization to describe the modern situation. He says that nowadays, only the consequences of the Enlightenment's premises remain. The institutional complexity of modern society would have separated itself from cultural modernity through the process of social differentiation. Gehlen defines this situation as a cultural crystallization, because modern culture has exhausted its resources, and cultural ideas can no longer produce the new, so central to modernity. The theory of a post-history is similar to that of the end of ideology, supported by authors with usually conservative tendencies. Post-history is the routinization and normalization of novelty and progress, namely that the benefits brought about by progress are now considered discounted. Already just these considerations alone, in itself trivial, together with the observation that the future often frightens and intimidates, can explain why we turn to the past with a sense of nostalgia. To history, a future is denied in the post-historical situation. Cultural values, presumed washed out in the present, can only be sought in the past, in the higher culture of the pre-industrial period. This vision of culture brings Gehlen closer to the theorists of the Frankfurt School, and their critique of modern culture. Both Theodor Adorno and Arnold Gehlen, despite the different political positions, believed that their contemporary culture had exhausted their possibilities for renewal. ontological security, and nostalgia. The theory of modernity proposed by Anthony Giddens differs, opposing it, from the mold of post-structuralist and postmodernist theories. These two approaches are heirs of a French philosophical current that has its greatest exponents in Baudrillard, Derrida, and Foucault, and offers a vision of society of nihilistic matrix. This philosophical thought presents, in some ways, striking analogies with the Frankfurter critical theory of mass society. The postmodern post-structuralist theories of both in the left and right versions have relaunched, in a sophisticated and current key, a type of social analysis that revolves around the concept of mass society, a society in which the individual is alone, frightened and impotent, exposed without defense to the manipulations that advertising, television, and the media exert on him. In the previous paragraph, it was argued that the critical theories of society, there was a discussion of the 1930s and 1940s variant expressed by the Frankfurt School, just as likewise German-style cultural pessimism in the philosophical anthropology contain in themselves typical elements of the nostalgic attitude towards a form of traditional society with clear division between high and popular culture, in which a convergence, integration, and homogeneity of values between the members of the community is supposed. In Modernity and Self-Identity, Giddens introduces the concept of ontological security. With this concept, he intends to describe the trust that most people place in the continuity of their identity, and in the constancy of the social and material world that surrounds them. Fundamental for the feeling of ontological security is a sense of trust towards people and things. The sense of ontological security is often lost in conjunction with serious and sudden socio-cultural changes. In these cases, as for example, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the transition from a real socialism to a liberal democratic system, it is clear that most individuals have lost the security and confidence in the continuity of their biographies and in the constancy of the social world. The collapse of socialism has meant not only the disappearance of a political system, but also profound changes in the social order and in daily life. The breakup of the communist system meant at the same time the failure of that classic model of modernity made by socialist ideology. The ontological insecurity inherent to this specific social change is twofold, as the social representations and visions of the future that still held true during the Cold War as a countermodel of socialism have also entered into crisis. The post-socialist world is a postmodern world with all the insecurities and risks of the second, reflective, or post-modernity, unknown until the collapse of communism. A strategy to combat the state of ontological insecurity, therefore, is represented by the orientation towards the past, traceable in cultural practices such as biographical narration or the reconstruction of memories, observable in post-socialist societies. Orientation towards the past is an ideologically motivated social and cognitive practice that seeks to produce the colonization of the future by referring to the past. The nostalgic hope that through these practices the past can be resurrected would, therefore, be capable of producing the lost ontological security. If, as will be specifically argued, no one seems to want socialism back, the one towards which the longing of many nostalgics is headed is instead the world of the early modernity, which in post-socialist countries is difficult to separate from a really existed socialism. Even those who have always lived in Western liberal democratic systems are longing for less complex and non-reflective modernity, identified with the prelapsarian reality before the fall of the wall and post-war economic stability. The attempt of the nostalgic discourse is in both cases to try to find those representations of security that characterized the first modernity. Nostalgia, modernity, and acceleration of history. 1. Irreversibility of time and sense of loss. The potential instability, in turn, explains the theory of the end of history, where history is interrupted in its linear or dialectical movement by a catastrophic singularity that is expressed in the exceptional form taken by contemporary events. Instead, the exponential stability has to do with the fact that it's no matter where you start, as you always end up at the same point. This is not because everything becomes unpredictable, but because everything is already there. Everything already has taken place. As opposed to the pain of homesickness, there is however another type of nostalgia, one for which you can no longer stay at home, the pain of homeland. The nostalgia's a neologism to describes those afflictions due to being tired and disgusted with the places where we live, with the current times, and ourselves. This feeling and the shift of the concept of nostalgia from a temporal to a spatial one have to do with the impression and perception of oneself as extraneous to the own contemporaneity, a period that is strongly felt in contrast with another precedent in which the nostalgic subject felt at home. Through nostalgia, individuals are free to settle in any part of their past, just as they feel like doing. Maurice Halbwachs chose to see precisely the potential for liberation contained in the nostalgic act, the fact that nostalgia allows, at least momentarily, as nostalgic feeling works intermittently, remaining in contact with reality, escaping temporal coercions. The magic of nostalgia is, according to the French sociologist, in its ability to circumvent the irreversibility and irrevocability of the passage of time. Space of experience and horizon of expectation, past futures. In future past, for a semantics of historical times, Reinhard Koselleck observes that the last 3 centuries have been marked by the continuous reproduction of the new and the different, understood as imaginative categories. Nostalgia, on the other hand, has a limited panorama and prefers repetition to novelty. From the 14th to the 18th century, we assist to a temporalization of history, a long process at the end of which modernity emerges as the consciousness of the future resulting from a past period. Historical time would, therefore, be generated by the movement of disjunction of the future from the past. Koselleck thinks of a linguistic organization capable of reconstructing historical situations that do not possess any, making use of concepts formed and defined ex post, therefore of scientific categories that are applied without being possible to document their confirmation based on the sources. 2 categories are hence suggested to the historian of concepts to understand the anthropological and human dimension of the new temporality, and the ways of internalizing the past and the future, the space of experience, and the horizon of expectation. These categories applied to historical research would allow seeing history itself more clearly, right in those situations in which it becomes more fruitful for the historical investigation itself to renounce the treatment of problems from a genetic perspective. The 2 expressions of space of experience and horizon of expectation are of common use, yet being so they are incapable, in themselves, of transmitting the knowledge of historical reality. Furthermore, being exclusively formal categories, they do not yet allow to infer what has been experienced and what is expected from case to case. Experience and expectation are 2 gnoseological categories that help to found the possibility of a story. Indeed, there would be no history that is not generated by these 2 categories. This conceptual couple is closed in itself, it does not pose alternatives, and moreover, each of its terms is not possible without the other. There is no expectation without experience, and experience without expectation. In this sense, they are historical categories which are equivalent to those of space and time. The abstraction and the conceptual synthesis of the temporal categories increase directly proportional to social differentiation. The true ability to understand history developed late, recalling Novalis' thought, when it became more common to observe a long series of events from above, without taking everything literally or capriciously confusing the different facts, coming to understand the secret link between past and future, and to learn to compose history by combining memory and hope. Hope lies in expectation as much as experience in remembering. History and its knowledge produce the internal connection between the past and the future of yesterday, today or tomorrow. Experience and expectation are 2 categories designed to analyze historical time, as they intertwine the past and future. They are useful and profitable for empirical research because they're enriched with adequate contents. They lead groups that act concretely in the realization of the social or political movement. Indeed, concrete history is generated and matured by being linked to certain experiences and certain expectations. The relationship between experience and expectation has shifted and transformed throughout history. The conceptual couple or space of experience horizon of expectation contains in each of its members a temporal coefficient of change. In modernity, the boundaries between the space of experience and the horizon of expectations begin to diverge. The expectation horizon acquires a historically new quality, susceptible to utopian dilatation. If history becomes a totality open to a future of progress, this is essentially the result of the Enlightenment and echo of the French Revolution. The Enlightenment's idea of progress at the surge of the revolution still accepts the classic patterns of behavior and conceives the present as the most advanced point on the continuum represented by progress imagined as infinite. Post-Enlightenment thinkers, although contemporary of the French Revolution, on the other hand, are aware both of the immeasurability of the experience existing between the ages and of the break between present and past. In the period called of the early modern age, starting from the French Revolution, a progress has conceptually clarified that the old and the new collide with each other in science and art, from one country to another, from a class to the other, from one rank to another, and this awareness has become a daily experience. The changes that occurred in the social and political structure after 1789 seem to actually transcend all traditional experiences. Modern age could have been conceived as a new historical time when expectations began to gradually move away from all previous experiences. At the time of the Revolution, although the generations still lived the same space and time of existence, their perspectives were structured in accordance with the political generation and the social point of view. The historical moment in which the transition from nostalgia for a place, thus from the spatial dimension to the temporal one, occurs, can therefore be dated to the decades following the French Revolution. The idea of progress through revolution or industrial development became central to 19th century European culture. From the 18th to the 19th century, the representation of time itself changed. Nostalgia, understood as historical emotion, would be the yearning for that space of experience that no longer corresponds to the new horizon of expectation. Nostalgic manifestations are collateral effects of the teleology of progress. In the mid-19th century, the generalized meaning of the term nostalgia, strengthened by the massive dislocation operations represented by industrialization and urbanization, standardized its meaning as a vague collective yearning for a time gone by, rather than an individual desire to return to a particular place. Nostalgia becomes the result of the irreversible sense of loss produced by the modern world, in which no authentic return is possible. The nostalgic phantasmagoric gaze records the permanence of the absence of the past. The remnants of the past recall the factuality of other kinds of present and other possibilities. Nostalgia is therefore a modern experience of the time, with its persistent perception of disaster and his empathy towards strangers stranded in the present. This experience of the time is a part of the more general experience of modernity, characterized by a feeling of disconnection from the past, a growing fear for the future, and uncertainty about the ability to act and reform. The sense of historical time is generated by the tension between experience and expectation, daily life and social processes. These obviously vary historically and contingently. Over the course of modernity and late modernity, experience and expectation have begun to diverge more and more. Their separation has influenced the way we think of the historical time in relation to daily life, and the breadth of each generation, and the lifetime. The change in the collective perception of historical change, acceleration. Reinhard Koselleck speaks in Stratifications of Time, in the chapter entitled Overlapping and Change of Temporal Dimensions of Denaturalization of the Experience of Time by means of technical acceleration factors. The whole history of time measurement can be described, also in consideration of its social function, as a history of growing abstraction. The modern state and bourgeois society had managed to obtain a surprising development in transport before the invention of technical acceleration tools. Koselleck lists a series of data and examples demonstrating the fact that even before the invention of the steam engine and of the mechanical loom, therefore of the discoveries that accelerated both transport and production in the leading textile production sector, there was an increasing rapidity in all areas of life, for example in communications with the telegraph. Increases in speed were in fact generally observable as early as the 17th century, and the causes of this are attributable to circumstances of a mercantile or political nature. However, these innovations clashed against natural limits, which managed to be overcome only by means of subsequent inventions in the technical field. But it is only after the French and Industrial Revolution that the acceleration theorem began to become a general empirical principle. Acceleration becomes everywhere, at that time, the common and present experience of the time of contemporaneity, an experience different from all the previous ones. Acceleration seems to overwhelm one area after another, not only the technical world of industry, the empirically controllable core of any acceleration, but in the same way daily life, politics, economy, population growth. The growing use of this term at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries testifies to the change in the feeling of time and of the consciousness of time, without, however, in this first moment, the common use of the concept had a particular theoretical or systematic significance. The question of acceleration, in hindsight, is set in the more general one concerning what, in essence, historical time is. If progress is the first genuinely historical category of the time, then acceleration is its specific variant. Specifically, acceleration is more than just change and more than mere progress, it qualifies as the progress of history, as an expression in circulation since 1800 states. Several thinkers, intellectuals and historians of the period between the 19th and 20th centuries have considered that the technological industrial circumstances of the whole modern history, even if not of the whole general history, are conceivable and representable, even without arriving at a logical model, through the heuristic model of the law of acceleration. If change is predictable for every story, modern change is only that change which generates a new experience of the time, meaning, everything changes faster than anything that might have been expected up to now or what had previously been experienced. The abbreviation of time frames involves the appearance of an unknown component in the daily life of the interested parties, a component that cannot be inferred from any previous experience. All this distinguishes the experience of acceleration. This is equivalent to saying that in modernity the rhythm of time, and the course of time can no longer be inferred neither from natural time nor from the succession of generations. In the Elective Affinities, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe expresses through Edward, one of the four main characters, his reflection on the end of the repeatability of what has been learned through the study, and its lasting applicability, supplanted by the need for what we will now call continuous learning, the learning of what is new every time. Alongside this consideration, it should be noted that the speed with which everything is learned again is increasing more, and also this circumstance contributes to arousing the experience of an accelerated change. The fact that nothing is certain except the imminent obsolescence of all our certainties as scientific theories, technology, styles and artistic schools, philosophies, political ideas, fashions naturally gives rise to the sense of provisionality that has been celebrated or deplored as intimate essence of the modern perspective, to the feeling that everything that was stable evaporates, in the quoted phrase of Marx and Engels. What is observed less frequently is that provisionality seems to guarantee in itself a certain continuity if it is conceived as an extension of the self-corrective procedures of scientific discovery, a social order based on science, with its overwhelming but stimulating expansion of our intellectual horizons, seems to have reached a form of immortality that previous generations did not even imagine. Koselleck invites us to think about the concept of acceleration from the generational point of view, which draws its evidence from the comparison of the generations who live together, and who share a common space of experience even if fragmented according to the perspective typical of each cohort of age. The German historian highlights the need to distinguish the analytical category of acceleration within itself, according to the causal components which, time after time, are at the origin of the increase in the speed of the rhythm and of the course of time. The acceleration that is recorded in periods of crisis in terms of political and institutional life, as in the case of civil wars, riots and unrest. Although this fact had already been found and described by the great Athenian historian Thucydides, the case of the French Revolution is exemplary, during which awareness of the contemporaries more and more grasped the entire history in the perspective of a growing acceleration. For example, Kant tried to found the thesis that revolutionary events could have retroactive effects on men's hopes, plans and actions, in the sign of progress and moral commitment, until the advent of a peaceful socio-political order and of a fair republic. Condorcet was convinced that he could predict, guide and accelerate mankind's progress through maintaining and supporting the revolution. In both views, there appears a conception of acceleration typical of the 18th century, for which acceleration is beneficial and useful only if a purpose to be achieved is indicated. This way of thinking is also found in the social, economic, and political analyses of French positivists such as Saint-Simon and his pupil Comte. It is thus pivotal to take properly the perception of acceleration into account, in case it is attributed more directly to political causes, in situations deriving from revolutions, political unrest, and systemic changes. Starting from the consideration of the work of François-Auguste René de Chateaubriand, a particular apprehension of a new type for the discontinuity is notable. Chateaubriand's reflections reveal the context of revolution and war of the 19th century, in which a modern history of remembrance and nostalgia can be conceived. Chateaubriand feels an irreversible transformation of history, from being founded on correspondence and contentment, to an urge to break and to difference, emphasizing how this nostalgic feeling of his is not the wound of a single individual, but is experienced on a shared level. The old man of times gone by was less unhappy and less isolated than today's man. If in living in the world, he had lost his friends, little else had changed around him. He may have become alien to youth, but not to society, complains Chateaubriand. After 1789, the man of the Ancien Régime becomes the latecomer, who in his life has experienced the death, not only of men, but of ideas, principles, customs, tastes, pleasures, punishment, opinions. Nothing all of this resembles what he used to know. He belongs to a different race of the human species. The reading of history provided by the French diplomat and famous writer of memoirs can in no way prescind from a revolution that destroyed social continuity, freeing the present from the past. History is interpreted from here onwards as a great and unique expropriation. Such a vision presupposes, in fact, a new configuration of temporality in conceiving the repercussions of the French Revolution. This event opens the way to a modern concept of historical discontinuity and periodicity, which appeared in circulation at the beginning of the 19th century, and which stands on breaking lines. Providing an articulated account of the sense of alienation perceived by Chateaubriand's contemporaries, in which the feeling of being out of place or of having died of a premature death predominates, together with the attempt to recover, at least partially, the discharged past. Certainly, it is not surprising that aristocrats and exiles feel nostalgia for the Ancien Régime. Nevertheless, it is precisely the enormous production and consumption of memories and other individual testimonies, as well as the genre of the autobiographical writing as a journey to exile, which suggests a transformation of the narrative forms, index and sign of a changed historical consciousness. Like The Fate of Nobles such as Chateaubriand speaks of the disorientation of a latecomer's amour. Generally, if the experience of exile can be statistically unrepresentative, as it involves only certain social groups, it still remains an example of the process of destruction of the past operated by the revolution, a figure of the shift from the authority of the past to that of the present. The crisis of memory observable in 19th century France is a crisis of memory which announced a new type of relationship with the past. It was not a simple or post-revolutionary nostalgia, but a nostalgia associated with the social changes resulting from the processes of industrialization, urbanization, demographic expansion, and the birth of the media industry, starting from the first newspapers. Such changes and transformations encouraged and presupposed a new awareness of the past. A conception of nostalgia is essentially modern, dependent on the notion of historical process understood as the continuous production of the new and the different. Here, the figure of the exile of the years following the revolution becomes an active metaphor for a new conception of historical times. A growing but fragmented corpus of scholars remarks how the French Revolution brought about a break in the consciousness of Western times, which consequently structured the way in which Europeans considered their place in history, their connections with the past, and its ability to perform as an active political subject. In order to be able to approach the phenomenon of nostalgia more appropriately, it is necessary to focus on the Western structures of temporality. Unfortunately, the temporal structures in which we operate, and in particular, Western assumptions about directionality, continuity, and progress in history, have not been subjected to systematic criticism in order to demystify its silent underlying authority, and to better understand social practices related to temporality. The sketching of a history of nostalgia is able to promise a lot, as it not only implies the development of the modern notions of historical change, but is moreover exemplary of criticism of the same notions. Nostalgia depends on a transformation in the collective understanding of historical change. One can only have a sort of a sporadic nostalgia, as long as misfortunes and catastrophes are perceived as transitory. Only when collectively there is the perception of being forcibly uprooted from one point in time and deposited in another, without having the possibility of a return to the previous one, do we have the conditions of the onset of a sense of nostalgia at the shared level. Nostalgia becomes a widespread social phenomenon demonstrated by its pervasiveness in the modern world, as well as by the outrage with which its temptations are rejected, when the perception and awareness spread that historical change is inflexible, violent, and general in its goals. The great watershed that reorganizes the structures of temporality in the first great modern uprising of the masses is the French Revolution. The experience of the French Revolution makes it possible to divide the present from the past and visualize the future as something entirely new. The past, present, and future thus become distinct ontological spaces. Literary protagonists like Benjamin Constant and Alexis de Tocqueville, belonging to the cohort following the first émigrés, already experienced another type of nostalgia, namely that of faithful republicans who grieved for the darkening of the revolution, rather than for the end of the monarchy. The English Romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge urged William Wordsworth to write a narrative poem, The Prelude, addressed to those who, following the complete failure of the French Revolution, have given up all hope of improving humanity, and are sinking into an almost Epicurean egoism, masking their contempt for visionary philosophes. Comments on the revolution, on social conditions, laws, ideas and feelings are made by Tocqueville in his work Democracy in America, where he notes, "Going back over the centuries to the most remote antiquities, I find nothing like what is happening before our eyes. The past sheds no light on the future, and the spirit of man falters in the night. If the past seems increasingly distant from the 19th century, this is due to the profound break in the experience mentioned, represented by the French Revolution. The narration of these experiences raises single tragedies to an inevitable common destiny, giving the figure of a new historical sensitivity. Europeans had experienced devastating turmoil before the Reformation and the 30 Years' War, but these were not understood in terms of fundamental change and did not alter the temporal identities of contemporaries. The Revolution and its dramatization instead deeply marked private and social life. The narrative of these transformation processes causes temporal differences, past, present and future, to take on crucial importance. It is analytically difficult to demonstrate the cumulative impact of the French Revolution on Western conceptions of historical continuity. Edmund Burke, a spiritual father of modern conservatism, wrote in 1790 that everything seems to be against nature, just as one of the most famous historians of the late 18th century, Johannes von Müller, repeats with profound amazement, everything becomes so different. Als wird so ganz anders. This last sentence perfectly reflects the sense of the colossal transformations brought about by modernity. Decades, generations, and cultural styles as nostalgic objects. The contemporary meaning of the term nostalgia was established in the 1920s. For those who had experienced the cataclysm of the First World War, disillusionment had been a collective experience, determined not only by the transition from youth to maturity, but by a succession of historical events that made the pre-war world appear as something innocent and far away. For the first time, an entire historical period took on the character once associated with childhood. Such a process, i.e. the superimposition of one's childhood to a more generic time of childhood, had already taken place when the pastoral concept was associated with a specific historical period, that of an agricultural society preceding the flourishing of the industrial system. It was probably inevitable that those who lived the transition age from an agricultural world to an industrial order would rediscover, in the memories of their childhood, the most beautiful images of a lost innocence. It was easy for men of the generation born around 1900 to identify the history of the 20th century with that of their own generation. Individuals who had lived through the war had a tendency to equate their personal history with collective history. That is a historicist conception of the generation, which sees precisely in this a set of individuals who lived at the same time a decisive and unrepeatable historical experience, drawing from it their moral orientation and the sense of sharing a common destiny. Not surprisingly, the very concept of generation began to be part of the terminology of the social sciences, precisely during the years of the 1920s, a decade in which Karl Mannheim worked on his authoritative essay entitled The Problem of Generations. In this essay, Mannheim begins to historically analyze the phenomenon of generation and illustrates the competing interpretative hypotheses available at that time, from which he derives the structuring of his sociological definition of generation. With it we start the socio-historical interpretation of generation. The concepts formulated by Mannheim are that of Generationslagerung, Generationszusammenhang, and Generationsinhalt. The lagering concept of positioning in the stratification represents an analytical dimension, borrowed from the Marxian concept of class position, and closely linked to the Mannheimian sociology of knowledge. For Mannheim, the social position is distinguishable in class position and generational position. In accordance with the concept of class, the Generationslage generational position is neither revocable nor necessarily conscious, but it can become conscious only if particular conditions exist. With the concept of generations laddering, a positioning of the generation, Mannheim means that individuals of the same age living in the same social space are exposed to the same social events and situations, and consequently have similar participatory, experiential, and event processing possibilities. The positioning as social and generational poses the conditions that determine the objective life expectancy of the group of peers. If the generations laddering indicates the correspondence in time and in the social space that characterizes a certain group, the Generationszusammenhang, a generational context, represents participation in the same destiny, the orientation towards the same historical and social problems, while the Generationsinhalt concerns how a groups belonging to the same generational context reacts and plans more or less uniformly. Ultimately, the story ended up being considered a succession of decades and generations, each of which succeeded the other precisely at an interval of about 10 years, so that the story came to be represented in the collective imagination as a sequence of cultural styles. According to Lasch, behind such a way of thinking there are the successes of the communication industry and its employees. Essayists and specialized journalists drew topics of discussion from the succession of different cultural styles, while gradually the communication itself became the subject of academic culture, and it entered the discourses of popular circuits more and more widely. The history of the 20th century was to be perceived, and consequently told, as a succession of decades and generations, each characterized by its own character. In The Country and the City, the social critic Raymond Williams generalizes about the ideological scheme of pastoral past, documenting the historical persistence of nostalgic feelings through the ages and concerning up to a generation back in time. Yet nostalgia for a certain period may concern generations far away in time. However, he says that not all nostalgia is the same. They mean different things compared to different historical circumstances and refer to quite different values. The causative factors of these changes are to be found in the industrialization and urbanization of the country, as well as, in the American case, in the experience of the Civil War. There is a subtle difference between the American and the Greek conception of nostalgia, based on experiences of culturally different senses and memories. While the former refers to a sentimental and trivial sweetening of memory, the latter evokes the sensorial dimension of memory brought about by a condition of exile or a process of cultural estrangement. If at the end of the 19th century the perception of change assumed dramatic contours, by the end of the 1920s it was finally clear that the speed would not decrease. The birth of the concept of decade as a unit of historical time thus has to do with the nostalgic feeling. The sense of confusion arising from the social processes generated by modernity, the culture of simultaneity, and the perception of acceleration would generate the modern need to understand the present together with the need to produce historical explanations. It has been stated on the basis of several historiographical sources that in the 1920s, the story was not written so much by professional historians as by journalists, literary critics, and social scientists. In the writings of several publicists of that period, three features could be traced: a sense of generational consciousness, the recognition of the presence of a disillusioned mood in the post-war period, an acute perception of the new. The concept of generation, crucial in the construction of the 1920s, passes from being conceived as the duration of a period to becoming a category to express shared experiences. If the explanatory models are cognitive and interpretative forms for the individual, the explanatory model underlying the term a generation is that of a cultural knowledge that serves to orientate in the world and has a meaning as conservation and creation of the reality at the same time. The concept of generation is important for understanding dynamic processes in the corporate space, in it the historical social time and the individual and personal time come together in a complex relationship. To give just one example, in 1988 a journalist for the American weekly New Week, Bill Barrell, commented on the idea of decade with these words: "Decades are not functions of calendar time, they are trends, values, and associations grouped and linked together in the national memory." Such an affirmation can give a sense of the construction of the idea of decade as a cultural category, apt to deconstruct the past by periodizing the present. The document of the past comes down to a sequence of cultural styles. In Mannheimian thought there is an idea that seems to contradict the concepts of formal sociology he developed to analyze the phenomenon of generations. This notion is that of entelecheia, and Mannheim seems to use it to indicate the ever-recurring basic intentions of humanity. Although Mannheim criticizes such a concept, developed from the history of art, insofar as it is not referable to social factors, it is conceivable that in the reception and dissemination of Mannheim's work the idea of entelecheia played a non-secondary role in the creation of those cultural styles referred to.